Hi, and welcome to CityWorks, a co-production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Every month here on CityWorks, we examine an aspect of the lives of working people on the job, at home, in New York, and in the greater urban landscape. First up today, video clips from a public program called A Tale of Two Cities Revisited, the social democracy experiments of the de Blasio years and the future of New York City. The program was organized by CUNY's School of Labor and Urban Studies and took place on September 30th. The program examined the successes, failures, and overall impact of New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's administration in four key areas: education, policing, housing, and the economy. When we've taken a look at the program, we're going to come back with an interview with Deepak Bhargava of the faculty of the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, on the brink of new city leadership and still in the early stages of a new administration in Washington. We'll address a key question facing working people in New York City and across the nation, namely, what is the shape of the progressive agenda today? And how do progressives imagine they'll get it done? That's all coming up. Meanwhile, enjoy.
I think the city, in theory, believes that anytime there is development in New York City, that it's ultimately going to serve the interests of the individuals that reside in the community by improving the quality of life and other aspects of that they're required. That are required for them to, not just survive here in New York City, but hopefully thrive. And that can't be achieved from our vantage point without ensuring that you are developing either skills training programs or creating an interconnected system that allows for folks that reside in that community to grow into potential jobs that will come online as the community is being developed. So it's not enough from our vantage point to provide, affordable housing. It's not enough to, build a new school. You have to ensure that the adults and out of school, out of work youth that reside in those communities have access to the jobs that will come online in the future. And there is simply not enough effort being made by the current administration to ensure that is occurring.
At face value, de Blasio has stayed true to his ambitious progressive campaign promises, but it only takes a little scratch to reveal that below the surface, these feats, these successes, all were the result of years of momentum and advocacy that created a wave that Mayor de Blasio merely rode. In fact, he really had to get dragged, kicking and screaming to achieve much of this progress because he simply could not stand up to the incredible pushback he received from the NYPD and other law enforcement leaders. For example, de Blasio ran on putting an end to the racist stop and frisk practice, as I just mentioned, which really drove a wedge between him and the NYPD even before he was sworn in. So he did not actually end stop and frisk, though he tried to take credit for it. There was a lawsuit that predated him, and that lawsuit forced the city to end stop and frisk. But what did de Blasio do when he took office? He actually named Bill Bratton, the original architect of stop and frisk, as his police commissioner, which doesn't seem to make much sense unless you look at the broader context. Just after he took office, a sea of NYPD officers literally turned their backs on him when he came to pay respect to the family of a police officer who was shot in the line of duty. He also rubbed NYPD leaders the wrong way when he verbally empathized with protesters who mobilized after the police killings of Eric Gardner here in New York and Michael Brown in the Midwest. And since then, he's just bent over backwards to avoid the ire of the police department. And so, what does that look like? Despite nationwide protests after George Floyd's murder that led to calls for reinvesting policing dollars into non-law enforcement alternatives, the city promised to cut $1 billion from the NYPD's $11 billion budget. But alas, the budget remained intact, and actually the NYPD budget increased this fiscal year. Another example is the plan to close Rikers Island has already been delayed. And as you mentioned, John, and as we'll talk about more, that plan has been delayed despite 12 deaths this year and inhumane conditions that include overflowing toilets, lack of sanitation, extreme violence, and people being denied food and prescription medicine. De Blasio will not accelerate incarceration in these circumstances or engage in what are going to be difficult negotiations with the corrections union regarding staffing and management issues that have plagued the agency for years and led us to this circumstance. So overall, even as a lame duck, he is not currently running for office, as we know, yet he is letting people die on Rikers Island for lack of basic care because he cannot stand up to traditional law enforcement lobby. And I think that alone speaks volumes about how successful his administration has been in achieving his very ambitious progressive goals that he espoused on his campaign.
Community groups and residents were really quite dissatisfied with some of the proposals that came out of the de Blasio administration, particularly in the early years of their first term. And so I think by and large, many of these proposals were implemented regardless of this really severe and fierce community backlash. And I think that also played a large part in sort of souring some of the relations, particularly the expectations that folks had going into that administration. And so alongside thinking about some of the progressive ideals that framed the administration, I think the larger context is the previous administration and how even the framing of this panel around Tale of Two Cities was some language that was echoed during that campaign. And in many ways, I think that this administration has messaged itself as sort of a departure from that Bloomberg era. But in many ways, I think these policies, particularly the over-reliance on the private market and incentivizing new development, in many ways gone farther than the Bloomberg administration in terms of providing more affordability, but still in ways that fell short. Have also revealed the ways that the two administrations on housing were maybe more alike than they were dissimilar. And so again, I think that may have been part of the root of the dissatisfaction.
We'll probably have Eric Adams as the next mayor, and he certainly didn't run on as progressive a platform as de Blasio. I think it means that folks who were unhappy with the progressive goals of the de Blasio administration, folks who were, from our sense, the more tough on crime, the more moderate conservative end of the spectrum, who were off-put by the uprising nationally around race and racial justice, around the pushback against police brutality, the calls for defunding, or whatever the language is you want to use, divest, invest, defund, budget justice, folks who are saying like, look, policing's not working. Our traditional structures are inherently racist. Those would have been extreme conversations, 5-10 years ago. And they are part of the mainstream conversation now. And so I think having Eric Adams having been essentially elected mayor shows that I think the kind of the pushback that we got to those conversations, those uber progressive conversations that have arisen post de Blasio's election, show that fear has worked in convincing folks that we've just gone a little too far with these progressive goals, I would say. And so, other candidates, at least in the criminal justice sense, they had really ambitious evidence-based proposals for prioritizing non-law enforcement, non-incarcerative interventions and responses to public safety that are similar to what we've seen in other jurisdictions. And yet they didn't win, right? The more traditional police officer, traditional law enforcement, traditional structures that many are calling inherently racist and needing reform, that guy won. And, I think that shows that fear-mongering and misinformation as a backlash to progressive ambitions have been successful and continue to be successful.
I think the number one priority of any mayor should be to lower class size, because that's a key driver for equity and one of the very few things that have been proven to work to improve student outcomes. If Eric Adams wants to do something that has clearly positive results for the people who elected him, is politically popular among every group in the city, including conservatives, independents, and Republicans on Staten Island, and has not been tried, I don't see what he has in his potential arsenal, except for lowering class size. So now that de Blasio has made his reputation on pre-K, I really don't see that there's anything less that has been both proven to work to narrow the achievement gap, really improve the quality of education in a fundamental way, especially for the majority of kids in our public schools who are in poverty, Black or Latinx. So I'm hoping that he understands that. He is also going to be having to deal with the extremely progressive city council that is made up of a majority of women for the first time, and I think a majority of people of color. If not, I'm pretty sure. And so he will have to contend with them as well. And I'm hoping that they will be as progressive as their campaigns made out. There are a number of people who were elected, who were former teachers, and also former activists on education, who I imagine will fight hard for those sorts of goals.
For the next administration, we're hopeful that they'll take, again, to my earlier point, a much more holistic approach around connecting economic development, workforce development, and housing, and all these other intersectional areas that I think are really vitally important. Justice involvement is important for folks in the community. Issues around K through 12 and class size is fundamentally important to folks, but so is food security, so is infrastructure, issues around accessibility for folks who are disabled. If you are 40 minutes away from a train stop, there's a direct correlation between your ability to succeed and or survive and thrive in this city. So we have to address all these different issues comprehensively and take an approach that is not simply talking about one of these issues over the other, but really a collective vision that really speaks to the average individual in New York City, who I believe thinks more holistically.
What folks may want to see from the Adams administration is a real investment in the lives of Black and Brown working folks, be it their safe habitation in public housing, free from chronic conditions like mold and lead poisoning, but also a different orientation to a political culture that, for example, in the de Blasio administration, really forcefully clashed with community groups that took issue with some of their policies. I think the Adams administration would be well served to go in a different direction and take very seriously the grassroots and community-based alternatives around, for example, a people's budget, again, local rezoning, community-based rezoning initiatives, and other alternatives for using public subsidy in ways that will invest in our existing public infrastructure rather than opening it up for further private market encroachment. I think the warning signs are not great on that. Eric Adams has already come out in statements towards the business and the Wall Street community with phrases like New York will no longer be anti-business. So I think that some of the battles over the de Blasio administration, as I think my colleague on the panel, Julian, alluded to, and the rise of the potential or incoming Adams administration reflects sort of a backlash against some of the more progressive goals that were really starting to pick up steam in different aspects of the de Blasio administration. So I fear a retrenchment in many ways, but I think in a way that will very likely lead to even fiercer political debate and conflict and contest. So again, I would really like to see the Adams administration take the alternatives and the solutions being brought up by grassroots and community organizations seriously and implement them as policy.
Lots of Black and Brown folks in poor communities, over-policed communities, communities that were stopped and frisked, voted for Adams as what James and I were saying is part of this backlash to this ambitious progressive ideals. And I think it's because the solutions to the problems that we've all mentioned, the path to achieve those ambitious progressive goals requires nuanced solutions. They're nuanced solutions, they're multifaceted solutions, they're interdisciplinary, as Jose was mentioning, and folks want answers now, right? And to have that interdisciplinary approach and gather that coalition takes time and effort and a lot of diplomacy. And this is just my opinion, but when people in your neighborhood are being shot and killed, you don't have time for long-term diplomacy and like these high-level conversations that we're having at a graduate program, right? You want to make sure that your kids are safe. And so having what feels like easy solutions, like having the police fan out into your community, despite some of the harms, it makes you feel safer. And it feels more palatable than these like broader discussions about, the multifaceted solutions to the everyday problems people are facing. I hope that wasn't too abstract, but I think like that's what makes it hard to really push in one term or two terms these progressive norms, is that you have a lot of pushback from the institutional structures you're trying to reform and change and maybe even get rid of and replace, while you also have a constituency that's like, I need answers now. I need to make sure these shootings are happening today. I don't really care about your long-term, like highfalutin descriptions about all the many ways we could come to the solutions I need today.
The CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies is the 25th and newest school under the CUNY umbrella. Dedicated to public service and social justice, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in the areas of labor studies and urban studies, and certificate programs in labor relations, public administration and public policy, healthcare policy and administration, and community leadership. We pride ourselves on being an institution that brings together activists and academics. Find out more at slu.cuny.edu.
Welcome back to CityWorks. With me now is Deepak Bhargava, professor at City University School of Labor and Urban Studies and a policy expert, especially in the areas of poverty, economic justice, racial equity, and immigration. Prior to joining CUNY, he was president and executive director of Community Change and Community Change Action, two of the premier national organizations supporting grassroots community organizing in low-income communities of color in this country. He recently launched the Leadership Center for Democracy and Social Justice at the Colin Powell School and the School of Labor and Urban Studies. He's got a lot to say about how the de Blasio administration fared, good, bad, and all the reverse. But I want to start, Deepak, by reminding people that although we call it the de Blasio administration, it was actually much more than that. And there was a whole progressive slate that came into power when de Blasio did, and they got some things done. I'd love to get your sense of what were the kind of greatest hits and greatest misses of this administration, which was much more than one man.
Well, it's great to be with you, Laura. And I think the highlights for me were that the de Blasio campaign was all about the tale of two cities, about the grotesque inequality that describes everyday life here in New York. And that was the power in the campaign. And I think there were grand hopes that there would be a kind of shining example of a city-based effort to really tackle racial and economic injustice. There were some very promising moves, particularly at the front end, around universal pre-K, around paid sick days for workers. But then, honestly, I think it felt to many that the energy went out of the administration when it came to social justice on issues like affordable housing, on confronting developers, and most of all on issues of police violence in the crucible of the movement for Black Lives Uprising last summer, that there was really a failure of leadership, a failure of nerve, a failure to confront the police establishment in this town and do what's right. So there were a lot of disappointments that I think we need to learn from. It is really important to emphasize, though, this isn't just the story of a person. There's a whole movement that is burgeoning in this city: labor, community, racial justice. And that movement is really finding expression in city politics. And you see it on the city council. You see it in the transformed state legislature. So even though there have been big disappointments, I'm very optimistic about the future and what that's going to bring.
Well, let's talk about some of the accomplishments of that council. I mean, we've reported on this program about the guaranteeing of a right to tenants to counsel, the lifting of the cap on street vendors. They got some pretty notable things done, but others that talk about a public bank and so on certainly didn't make much progress as far as I can see.
Yeah, there was very notable progress on issues related to worker rights. In particular, the city council now has a really powerful progressive bloc that holds real leverage in a way that hasn't been true for decades in the city. So the most ambitious kind of parts of a social democratic agenda, that hasn't happened yet in New York. And in fact, if we're really honest about it, inequality continues to grow in the city. So much more ambitious reforms are necessary, but we at least had a taste of what positive reform could look like and what it looks like for progressives to really exercise power at the municipal level. So it's just
but let's just drill down on that a little bit. I mean, you just said that this progressive bloc is burgeoning. Some parts of that bloc were in power with de Blasio. We're going into a new administration, and yet inequality is increasing. How do you explain it? What happened? Where were some of the weak points? And where do you think movements come in and grassroots groups? What could they have done better? What do you think they should do better next time to push from the outside?
Yeah. Well, I think the truth is New York has a power elite, an establishment that is incredibly entrenched and incredibly powerful. We saw that one aspect of that with the police unions and the role they played last year and on an ongoing basis for many years in kind of undermining calls for racial justice. But it's also the real estate industry, which for generations has set the terms of debate in the city about taxes, economic policy, housing policy. Those are formidable. So we should not be naive that it's just an election or just a campaign slogan that's going to result in transformation. Now, it has to be said that the positive thing here is that there is an insurgent movement in this city. You see it in community organizations. You see it in the energy around the Democratic Socialists of America and the work that they've done. You see it in the Working Families Party. And that energy, I believe, is just at the beginning of taking off. So yes, I think we can be disappointed at what some elected officials have produced, but we should be actually quite proud of what the movements have done because they've reset the terms of debate and now I think are on track to be able to force more delivery from our electeds. And we have a much more progressive city council. We have an incoming city council that's much more progressive than what we've ever seen before.
What's your take on Eric Adams?
Well, I think he is going to be in a difficult position. He clearly is running as a kind of successor to the billionaire mayor, Michael Bloomberg, and ran away from aggressive stances on policing and reducing the police budget and so forth. So I think there's real reasons to be concerned. The difference between the Bloomberg and the Giuliani years, though, is that he will be confronted both by an aggressive and empowered city council and by vibrant social movements in the city. And so I'm actually, it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out. He is going to try to take us even further back, I think. We'll see. He has to be given the benefit of the doubt to prove us wrong. But there's a good chance that aggressive movement can push him left and push the politics of the city left.
There are some interesting cracks in his armor. That's perhaps the wrong way of putting it. There's some possible openings, put it that way, in Eric Adams' past commitment to participatory budgeting, something that he proposed and encouraged in the Department of Education years back. If he were to come in now, it would be the biggest participatory budgeting program. If he were to come in with a commitment to that in the city, more generally, it would be the biggest city in the country to practice that kind of bottom-up democracy around spending, at least some spending.
It would be a huge deal if it really happened. I mean, what this city desperately needs more of is more democracy, more small d democracy at every level, at the neighborhood level where residents really see that what they say they need in terms of public services results in a response. The New York political establishment has been so tone deaf for so long to the needs of working class New York, to communities of color, that if you did that, I think it would be an extraordinarily positive step, and it would mean devolving some power to neighborhood residents, and that would be a hugely positive step. And I think there are real examples of leaders and organizations that are committed to that, and the partnership between them and social movement leaders, community organizations, that's the glue, that's the indispensable glue for this to work.
Well, thanks for being part of the indispensable glue, Deepak. I'm afraid that's it for this episode of City Works. Deepak Bhargava is a faculty member at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. And if you have questions or comments about this conversation, or if you want to try your hand at applying, you can find out more by emailing us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For City Works, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for joining us.